Influence Continuum. This is a podcast all about influence, not just destructive influence like the ones we see in cults, but also the ethical, healthy side of influence. Hello, I'm Dr. Stephen Hassan with another episode of the Influence Continuum. And I'm very grateful to have a distinguished psychiatrist, scientist, entrepreneur, and author of a book that I love, Dr. Carl D. Marci, called Rewired, Protecting Your Brain in the Digital Age. And Dr. Marci, I first read about you in the Boston Globe, and I said, how come I don't know this man? Oh, he's at Harvard. And I reached out to you, and you kindly consented to this interview. I just want to say you're currently the chief psychiatrist, managing director of mental health and neuroscience at OM1, a health technology and data company based in Boston. You're a board certified psychiatrist at Massachusetts General Hospital, part-time assistant professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, where you also did your MD with honors. You're a Rhodes Scholar. I could go on and on with your credentials, but wow. You are a psychiatrist and a social neuroscientist. And I must say, I first listened to your book on Audible, and I said, I need to get a copy because I really want to read this over and over again because it's so central to what I think is a critical issue around the world today. So what I'd like to do, if I may, Dr. Marci, is just ask you a question and just start this way. Your book is filled with science. It's peer-reviewed by Harvard Press. You emphasize the importance of social bonding for all of our well-being. You rightly point out that our social connections are undergoing a massive metamorphosis thanks to burgeoning social media. And indeed, we live in an age of large, superficial online social networks that drain our time and attention. So you talk about the importance of social bonding. You talk about, how we need to be wired for maximum health, and then how we're getting rewired by the digital circumstances. And I love your chapter 9, where you give practical advice on what we can do to protect ourselves and go forward. So with that introduction, please share with our listeners some of the more important points you'd like to make.
Yeah, sure. First of all, thank you for your interest in the book and for inviting me on your podcast. It's hard to know where to begin, but what I do in the book is begin where we all began, at birth. And it's important for your audience to know that the human brain at birth is very unique in that it's only 10% developed. That means 90% of brain development occurs outside of the womb. And if you also think about it from a social community perspective, we don't let our offspring typically go off on their own until they're about 17, 18, 19 years old. That's a really long time. And so we shouldn't be surprised that our brains have these network of neurons that allow us to make very deep and profound and ultimately important bonds and connections, one brain to another. So you made a reference to social neuroscience. So I was the first director of social neuroscience at Massachusetts General Hospital. And I remember when I was talking about that title, the head of the department at the time, Jerry Rosenbaum, said, well, I'll give you the title if you tell me what it is. Because it was a very new field. Unfortunately, the first textbook had been written, so I bought a copy of the textbook and I said, "Look, it's a textbook; it's got to be real." But the evolution is I think, if you're interested in the history of science, you start with neural science, which is the study of neurons, individual neurons, and how they connect with one another. You then graduate to neuroscience, which is networks of neurons, and then you're studying the individual brain. And then the cognitive psychologists, the people who think about thinking, said, wait a second, maybe we could combine our thinking about thinking and cognitive psychology with neuroscience, and that became cognitive neuroscience. And then no one should be surprised that the emotion researchers, the affective psychologists got in the game. So we have affective neuroscience, emotion studies of the brain. And then, finally, the social psychologist and anyone thinking about how we actually live said, time out. Everyone is focused on individuals. We don't live like that. We need to really think about how we work as a community. So social neuroscience is really the study of how our brains are in commune with each other. And like I said, a lot of that evolved because babies and infants at birth are so incredibly vulnerable. That there's a whole field of social attachment and the brain science associated with that. And the core premise of the book is that this very precious ability for us to connect is being disrupted by technology.
Exactly. And for my listeners know that I'm interested in brainwashing and mind control. And so a lot of my research as a mental health professional is social psychology applied. But I'm fascinated by neuroscience, and your book is chock full of the science that I feel everyone needs to understand, because the implications are world-changing, really. Human species have never been in digital environments except in the last couple of decades.
Yeah, let's just talk about the technology for a second, right? So if you look at the history of technology adoption, historians use the rate of adoption from about 45% penetration to a population to about 75%, right? And it took electricity and the light bulb about 15 years to do that. It took the internet and computers about 10 years to achieve that milestone. Television was the reigning champion at 5 years. And then along comes the smartphone. In that atom-splitting moment in 2007, when Steve Jobs gets up on a stage, and a mere 3 years later, we have 75% penetration. So it's really an extraordinary acceleration of technology in what I and others have called an uncontrolled global experiment, with people walking around with supercomputers in their pockets, connected to the internet and everything that brings. Hard enough for adults, even harder for children, and that's why the book takes a developmental perspective, again from birth through developmental stages, and says, look, we have developmental neuroscience, and we actually know a lot about the brain at different life stages. Why don't we take, my big idea was to take the lens of neuroscience from a developmental perspective and then say, what is appropriate at that age? Right?
Great.
We don't let children drive a car until they're at least 16-year-olds. They've passed a test, an eye test, a cognitive test, and then typically they have to have a chaperone for a few years, and even then their insurance rates are really high. Right? Why would we give an 11-year-old again a computer in their pocket that has the computational power of 10 times what it took to put a man on the moon, connected to the entire library of what's in the world and all the entertainment and risk that goes with it? It's just a bad idea, right? So we need to move past that.
And not having data privacy protections, because companies are gathering all of our preferences, developing marketing profiles, plus unregulated social media that says, oh, free speech. We should let everybody say whatever they want. And look at the mess that has caused.
Well, and to that point, I think there's always a healthy tension between the government regulation and free markets, and we could debate that all day. But I do think in this case, things have gotten a little out of balance. And when, again, from a child development perspective, when we're exposing children to, user-generated content that has one purpose, which is to hook people on that video and get them to watch more, and ignores the need to educate kids, B, the fact that you're actually distracting kids from the thing they need most, which is human face-to-face interaction, play, exploring the world, and reciprocal feedback, which is what even you and I were both nodding, right? Our brains are kind of resonating with each other in a way that you can't do that with a static video. You just can't do it, and that's that's something we learned actually a few years ago, and I tell the story in the book about the Baby Einstein series. Do you want to hear that?
Yes. Yeah, but let me just first say that I watched the Social Dilemma documentary that Tristan Harris and Asa Raskin and the Center for Humane Technology did, and they interviewed former executives of these social media platforms, and they say we won't let our kids be on screens till at least 4 years of age, which jives with, I think, your recommendations.
Sure. Let's start with the American Academy of Pediatrics, right, which actually has very good recommendations that I suggest. I quote in the book, and I recommend all parents should review. The American Academy of Pediatrics says zero screen time until age 2, with one exception, and that's telephony, FaceTime, Zoom with typically grandparents and parents. Now, and if you think about that exception, makes sense because it's just like what you and I are doing right here. It's not exactly face to face, but it's pretty darn close. I say 3 in the book because I think 2 is still too young. And part of the reason I say that is because of the vulnerability of the human brain at that age, and other studies that show for every hour a child from 1 to 3 consumes media per day, their risk of ADHD at age 7 goes up 10%. Yeah, that's a big number. The other thing I like to talk about and wrote extensively in the book is what's called the video transfer deficit. Now, that sounds technical, but let's start with something that's not technical. Baby Einstein. So it was around 1996. This mom in the basement of her home borrows a video camera and has a newborn. And she's got the right sort of instinct, which is, how do I educate my newborn? And is there something out there that I can, give her, I think it was a girl, to do that would be enriching? So she created a series of videos that were essentially hand puppets with, some classical music in the background. And they were wildly successful. And parents were bragging about
Commercially wildly
thank
successful.
You for that clarification. We'll get to that in a second. So commercially very successful. At one point, there 2/3 of American households with children under the age of 3 had at least one of these DVDs or VHSs in their home. And there were people bragging about how their child could sit for hours and stare at these videos. They must be learning. They won awards. Disney ultimately bought Baby Einstein, and there's a quote from the CEO of Disney saying, yet another wonderful contribution to the Disney family, learning and educating young minds. Right? Okay. Now, what happened? Well, in 2006, 2007, research started to come out and show that not only were children under 3 exposed to Baby Einstein videos not learning at an accelerated rate compared to their peers, they were falling behind. And this is where researchers started to really hone in and say what's going on. And the video transfer deficit that I referred to earlier is the fact that a brain under the age of 3 just does not have the neural scaffolding to take information from a 2-dimensional world and apply it to a 3-dimensional world. Full stop. They just can't do it. So all you're doing is distracting that baby, that young child, from the things they should be doing, right? So now consider the fact that when I was young, the average age of media consumption, back then television, was 4 years old. Now it's 4 months, right? The earliest age of exposure, and around 9 months, kids are exposed to it on a daily basis, and something like 90% of kids under the age of 2 have access to a mobile phone. This is just, we haven't even got into, age 3 to 5, right? So the big concern in that early stage is that really we should be protecting these children from any exposure to any media, full stop. 3 to 5, we get into another lane. Do you want to talk about that?
Please. I think that everyone needs to read this book. And please invite Dr. Marci to come speak, because seriously, we're in a crisis mode in the world, and I think that there are bad actors using social media to radicalize people and put all kinds of crazy, insane beliefs that are making people delusional. So we need to think the healthy track, what's been done to us, but then how to protect ourselves. So the platform is yours.
And we'll get to social media as the child gets a little older. Typically at the 3 to 5 age range, the issue that I highlight is the need to learn to read, right? So if you think about reading as a human skill, is really only in the order of about 3 to 5,000 years old. And we've been on the planet. Well, we've been on the planet as Homo sapiens for about 60,000 years. So this is late stage stuff. Right. And so we don't have a neural structure for reading. We have to borrow from our visual cortex, from our language cortex, our prefrontal cortex, and we need to synchronize that. And that's why the American Academy of Pediatrics again suggests exposing children to reading from day one out of the womb, because it takes a long time to build that neural scaffolding to do reading. Okay, some interesting research came out a few years ago looking at the network of neurons that are critical to early reading, and did something very simple, which is took kids who were not exposed to much media in the home and compared them to kids in a fMRI, a functional magnetic resonance imaging device that takes pictures of a healthy brain, and compare them to kids who were exposed to a lot of media in the home. And sadly, what they found is the kids exposed to a lot of media, that network that's so critical for reading did not light up as extensively as it should. And we know that the ability to read is so critical to future academic success that's just something that I really focus on in that age group to start there.
When my wife and I adopted a little boy from Ukraine when he was 2 years old, I was advised to read to him, picture books, but reading. And so my child could hear words and get used to sitting with a book and looking at the pictures and using my finger. And it was really important. And we managed to keep him off a smartphone till middle school. We were told, give him a flip phone so he can call if he needs you to be picked up or something.
I love that story. I would add, in addition to reading to him and giving him feedback that he was taking in with his visual system and his auditory system, I'm guessing you were also lap sitting or sitting next to each other, so you've got this physical touch.
Oh, mostly actually bedtime reading.
So you've got physical touch. You're also in a
Yep.
reciprocal way looking at him. He can ask you questions. He's interacting with the book. You're pausing to explain things. I mean, if you break down what you were doing beautifully to that 2-year-old, it's really what every parent should do. And the richness of that interaction, right? If we were to pause and think about it, relative to a child sitting and watching a video on a smartphone, to me is night and day. So you shouldn't be surprised that these kids are growing up and having trouble.
Yes, exactly. So please proceed along the developmental track, and let's get to adults and what's happening now.
Okay, let's not skip ahead too quickly.
Yeah,
so now we've got the sort of 5 to 9, 10 years old, right? Latency, which in many ways is a lovely age because the kids still idealize their parents and caregivers. They're old enough to take direction pretty well,
right.
And their brain, particularly their prefrontal cortex, is matured enough where they have some impulse control. And I want to pause and talk about the prefrontal cortex, if I may. So the brain is very complex, right? 80 to 100 billion neurons, each one making between 10 and 20,000 connections. It's thought to be one of the most complex entities in the known universe. And what's really cool is we all have one. And I make very few predictions or guarantees in life, but I guarantee that the brain that you had and I had and your listeners had at the beginning of this conversation to the end is not the same. Why? Well, because as we're talking and as your listeners hopefully are listening and paying attention, their emotion centers are directing that attention to certain bits of information and they're firing. And if that emotion center fires at a particular level, you're going to lay down a memory trace. And if we're really good here, Dr. Hassan, we might even inspire some of your listeners to change their behavior. Whether it's with their children, maybe they go out and buy my book, or any number of things that they might consider doing. That series of events I just described, attention to something that emotionally moves you, lays down a memory trace, and ultimately changes your behavior, is a definition of engagement that I created a number of years ago when I was doing consumer neuroscience. And what's interesting is it applies very well to how we engage with the world. What's critically important is it starts with attention, right? And then it goes to emotion, and part of emotion is reward. And what the social media companies and big technology companies and all of the many things on the internet are designed to do is grab your attention first and then fire your emotion and reward centers. And we know
that's the key is understanding emotional activation is the key to cognitive growth and
exactly.
Learning, right?
So people make the mistake of thinking of humans as rational creatures who are occasionally emotional. As you know, we're emotional creatures who are occasionally rational.
Or rationalizing.
Or rationalizing. There's a nice corollary to this that a friend of mine gave me, which is that we're most rational when we feel safe and secure. Right, which I imagine resonates with you in some of your work, right? Because a lot of, hijacking people is to make them feel uncomfortable.
It takes the frontal cortex, the prefrontal cortex offline to be rageful, fearful.
Exactly. So think of the prefrontal cortex as the arbiter of our executive function, the conductor in our own personal symphonies, the difference between impulsivity and impulse control, the difference between recklessness and self-control, and the difference between habit and addiction, right? This part of the brain, which sits right here behind our forehead and our orbits, is by far the most highly evolved part of the brain. It's the most interconnected part of the brain. And think of it as having sort of a kind of a reciprocal relationship with our emotion and our reward centers, right? So the prefrontal cortex, should be in charge, should be able to tamp down. Now, it needs information from the reward centers and the emotion centers. But when these things, the emotion centers become too hot and this too cold, things get out of balance, right? And that's essentially addiction, right? So people who are addicted to opiates or cocaine or any number of substances, their prefrontal cortex is shut down to the point where the reward centers are driving the bus. And what they're doing is they're just guiding you to the next high and the next reward because that's right, the dopamine high, right? So now, if I were to tell you that, well, there's studies that show you could take adolescents, teenagers, and put them in an fMRI machine and study their reward centers, and you give kids photographs, random photographs, and you alter one thing, which is a number on those photographs, and you tell them that those numbers represent the number of likes, guess what happens? The higher the number, the more the reward centers light up, right? So we know that two things. One, we know that sharing information lights up the reward centers, and then getting information back, what we've now all been conditioned to, thumbs up and likes, stimulates the reward centers in very powerful ways. But back to our 5 and 10-year-olds, right? So the prefrontal cortex now is at a stage where there's a little bit more balance, right? Because if you watch, young kids, they're phenomenally impulsive, right? You have to watch them constantly. They'll walk into the street and get hit by a car, right? You cannot let these kids out of your sight for a second. Now you get to about 5, 6, 7, 8. You get in that latency period, and kids have a little bit more control, right? They can read. They can begin to do math. School. Their brains are exploding, but internally. But the size of the brain has actually started to level off a little bit. And what gets introduced, and what I talk about in that age in the book developmentally, are computers at school, computers for learning, and more screens for entertainment. And what gets introduced is what I think is one of the most insidious thing, and something I spent a lot of time talking about, in the book, is this idea of media multitasking. Right, and so media multitasking is very simply the idea is you're consuming one channel of media and simultaneously doing something else. Now that something else might be a task, or it might be another channel of media. So you're at home watching TV and you got your phone out, That's medium. Yeah, look,
Guilty.
we all do it. Or you're
Guilty.
at work.
Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, podcasts, whatever. But the brain can't multitask,
You're
right?
emailing
That's
and you're
what
checking your social media feed or talking to a friend. I mean, I can't tell you now at work because we're all Zooming. You could just tell when someone's like staring at the screen. It's like you're not paying attention, right? You're obviously doing something else. And I'll say, "Hey, Joe, do you mind stopping for a second? I have a question for you."
Yeah, and put the phone down, out of sight, turn it off when you're engaged socially is another big message.
Right.
But
No,
anyway, keep
you're
going.
right on.
Please.
So what I talk about is this age is where you begin to introduce media multitasking, right? Because kids are starting, they're gone from 1 to 3 hours a day of media consumption now to sort of 3 to 5 hours per day, right? In the sort of 5 to 10 age. And you start to do things and video games and all kinds of screen content that you can imagine. The risk is the earlier you introduce any kind of media multitasking, the more hooked people get to it. Because if we go back to the reward centers for a second, Steve, that what you need to keep in mind is that study after study after study after study has shown that multitasking of any kind results in two things: slower processing speed and increased error rate. So let me do that again. Study after study after study after study shows that the more you multitask, right, the slower you actually process information and the more errors you make. So why do we all do it? Why do we all do it? Well, the reason is it's a brain trick, right? If you're doing two things at once, you have to work harder, right? And your brain has to work harder.
Yeah.
Well, what have we learned growing up? The harder you work, the more productive we are, right? So we think we're more productive because we're working hard, even though when you actually measure the productivity, it's actually quite bad. So it's this insidious brain trick that's very unfortunate and is leading a whole generation to do a whole lot of multitasking.
It's an erroneous belief, and it's one of those things that it makes us feel smarter that we're doing multiple things, but in terms of actual productivity and quality of work, the studies show it goes
100%.
down.
And now we can segue to social media because as we enter the sort of teen years, that becomes a really critical channel for all kinds of reasons. But when you look at the multitasking data, particularly in adolescence, the number one offender while doing homework that interrupts the brain circuitry is social media. And I believe that part of the reason is because it's so compelling, right? It's your friends, and they're reaching out, and you want to react, and you want to get those likes. I mean, how can algebra compete with that, right? How can American history compete with that, right? And so this is where we have to begin to have a conversation about digital literacy and really protecting our kids, or they're going to get in trouble.
And I have to jump ahead, and then we'll come back, please, to FOMA, fear of missing out,
yes.
to what FOMO, to what you recommend, the joy of missing.
Sure.
Right?
As we get through to adulthood, and adults suffer the same problems all the other ones do, we begin to have a conversation about is there hope? Because I even myself, like, first of all, when I went into this research 7 years ago, I was actually curious of what I would find, because I was doing research in consumer neuroscience and seeing behaviors that, to me as a psychiatrist, began to look like addiction. And I was just like, wait a second, I've treated patients who have opiate addiction. I've treated patients with cocaine addiction. I've treated patients with alcohol addiction. I've treated patients with gambling addiction. I've never treated anyone with a smartphone addiction. Like, is that even a thing? So as I began, now it is. 7 years ago, people weren't sure. Right? As I started to look into this, and the more I read, the more I did research, the more I realized, wow, this is a bit more of a thing than I thought. I wasn't alone in my concerns, and that there was a ton of brilliant academic work happening in traditional media as well as new media that could inform a thesis. And the thesis I had, again, was that we are putting our prefrontal cortex at risk by doing the 3Ds, right? We are distracting ourselves, we are dividing ourselves, and we're making ourselves depressed. And so I think that that's really where all this goes. But to JOMO, which is the corollary and the antidote to FOMO. As I was writing the book, the third section, I wanted to dedicate a significant part to hope and things we could do, right?
Yes.
So I came up with 10
practical advice, and all of them were like, yes, please share with our listeners. And we want you to go out and buy this book. At the very least, buy the Audible version, listen to it. But if you are like me, you're going to want to read it, because that's a different part of your brain, reading than listening in terms of learning.
And I will say another recommendation, if you recall, is paper over pixels. So you are going to retain more of the book if you buy the hardcover or the paperback and you read it on paper. So a plug for good old-fashioned books. We'll get to that in a minute.
Yep.
But I want to say before we talk about these recommendations that I wanted not only to have enough of them to be meaningful and not sort of trite surface recommendations. I wanted them grounded in the same science that I used to come to the conclusions I've come to in the book. So each one of the recommendations, as I put it forth, I also talk about the science behind how this is likely to make your prefrontal cortex healthier and more resilient. Right, so that's really the goal of these recommendations. So choose JOMO over FOMO. Is number 2. Number 1, by the way, is stop media multitasking and stop multitasking. Right, that's should be an easy one.
And turn off notifications and schedule time to when you check email and whatever. But get your work done.
Embrace monotasking.
Focus. Yes, monotasking.
And serial monotasking is fine. And I have to block out time on my calendar to not email and do deep thinking. I need to literally put my phone away. I love this study I have to share with you and your audience, right? And that I think summarizes a lot of this, right? So they took, in this case, it was college kids doing a math test. And they had 3 conditions, right? So condition 1, leave the phone outside the room where the math test was at. Condition 2, put it under your chair. Condition 3, put it on the desktop upside down. Okay. Now, in all 3 conditions, the phone's off, right? You have to turn it off because they're taking a math test. The results were a step function, right? So the further away the phone was, the better their scores were, and the closer it was, the worse they were. So the mere presence of the device actually interrupted their ability to do math. Other studies have shown the mere presence of the device interrupts social relationships. So people with the phone in between them actually have a different conversation than if that phone is not there. Now, why is that? Well, part of the reason that I hypothesize is this notion of divided attention, right? So just knowing it's there and all the things it can do. And by the way, I'm not against technology. I've got smartphones and tablets and computers. I mean, they're amazing devices that are, transforming the world, no question. But just like when the automobile was introduced in 1907, and it took 10 years before there was a stop sign, a lot of people died, and there were a lot of accidents, right? So it's time we need a few stop signs on the information superhighway. But back to the point here, as we think about JOMO and FOMO, the idea is to step back and realize that there are other rewards in the world besides social media. That social media, although can bring joy in terms of connecting people at a distance, sharing information with loved ones who maybe you don't talk to that much, connecting with friends, preferably to meet up and have face-to-face interactions. If used properly, and can be a source of information too. If used properly, it can serve a perfectly reasonable function. What happens is if it becomes a means to an end, you get in trouble. And what also happens is if it becomes a place where we get identity confusion. So another recommendation is be careful with your online identity. And if you think about social identity theory, and I quote Erik Erikson in the book, the great developmental psychologist, who said, as a teenager and adolescence, there are really only two questions: who am I, and how do I fit in?
Yeah, he wrote the critical book on identity.
Right, and so,
Erik
and if you
Erikson.
think about it, how do you do that if you've got a different identity in one social media platform and a different one in another social media platform and a different one when you're at home with your parents or with your friends? Right, it's very confusing because, as Shakespeare said, all the world's a stage and we are merely actors in it. Well, he only anticipated one stage, not five, right? And we have the opportunity, and you've done well managing lots of different platforms for your own work, that they have to be.
I hire
Yeah,
people.
that's one way to do it.
That's how I manage it because I can't. It's too much. It's
but
not
if you're
healthy.
15, you can't hire people, right? And you're trying to manage it yourself, and you get into some identity confusion. And I think that's been, another source of issue.
And I think it was Goffman who came up with presentation of self.
That's right. And social identity theory. He's the
a lot
father.
of. Yeah, and those of us who've studied radicalization online talk about social learning theory and contagion effects. If somebody goes out and does a mass shooting and they're on social media, it affects us. And people learn bad things and do bad things.
You've inspired me to think a little bit about this. As you and I were talking, preparing for this conversation, I said I've always been intrigued by how otherwise healthy seeming people can become radicalized relatively quickly to do horrible things. And the more I thought about that, the more I realized, well, maybe this isn't so surprising in the modern world where you've already got a distracted and dare I say, partially damaged prefrontal cortex, right? People are not at their best. And then you've got maybe young people who are experimenting with different identities online, not really clear who they are, who maybe have a bad day or a bad week or bad month because bad things happen, life happens, and their brains become very vulnerable to any kind of outside influence that might be promising things that they can't deliver. Does that resonate with you?
Absolutely, and sleep deprivation and going online while they're super stoned. I can't tell you how many people have gotten recruited into destructive cults because they were just curious and algorithms were suggesting videos to them
while they were high.
Or suggesting friends while they're high, while they're sleep deprived. And one thing about cult recruiters, they're taught to love bomb, to flatter. Oh, you're so special. You're so smart. Tell me more about yourself. And what's different now than it was when I was recruited into a cult in the mid-'70s is when cult members had to recruit, they had to ask questions in person to find out the person's background and where their vulnerabilities or the parents divorced, right? Or now you can buy stuff on people if you want to do a targeted attack on a specific, affluent person or high profile person. So it's just getting exponentially disturbing. I just interviewed Rand Waltzman, who's an Information Professionals Association co-founder, who's been doing computer and AI stuff for 50 years. And he said, beware the metaverse. He said, as bad as things are now, think about how much data can be gathered on you in real time and how authoritarian political leaders or whatever can control on scale and customize messaging.
Well, and not
unconsciously.
Not to mention, and years ago I had an early experience on the Facebook campus with the next generation Oculus, just how rewarding it is to be in an environment you can control every aspect of it. Right. I mean, it's going to be, it's going to be something we're going to have to reconcile with as a society. There's no question about it. But you mentioned sleep. So another recommendation in the book is to protect your sleep. And when you look at the data on sleep in the brain, it's very clear that we spend a third of our lives in the semi-conscious state. Children need more of it than adults do, and they need plenty of it because their brains are growing so quickly. But even adults need between 7 and 9 hours a night of sleep. And all this technology makes it very hard to get that rest. And what does sleep do? Well, besides restoring our bodies, what it does for our brains is allow us to consolidate memories. And there's a big debate in the literature about whether we sleep to remember, meaning we sleep to sort of form memories and consolidate the important ones, or sleep to forget. Let's wash away the things that aren't necessary, or some combination of the two. But regardless, we know for a fact that without sleep, learning can't occur. And then to your point, the other thing that happens when we're sleep deprived is our prefrontal cortex doesn't work as well. So we become vulnerable to our emotional states and rewards. So I'm glad you brought that up. So a recommendation there is, for parents, I say, look, you just if you're going to let them have smartphones, you got to collect them before bedtime, and lock them up at least an hour before, and get all the screens out of your room. On average, the American adolescent has 5 screens in their bedroom, on average, right? They've got a computer,
Wow.
a television, some kind of game console, a tablet, and a smartphone. 5.
And am I remembering correctly your statistic about 11 hours that they're online versus 5 or 6 that old fogies like me are online?
Not quite. So it turns
something?
out adults do trump teenagers. Adolescents on the order of 9 hours a day. But again, that's half of our waking hours.
That's a lot.
Adults are pushing 11 in this country.
The adults
right.
are, so they're more than...
So if you look at media consumption from birth to adulthood, it really does go up pretty steadily. Now, what's driving that is, the ability to use this on the go in a way that we couldn't consume media on the go previously, and importantly, media multitasking, including in places where we couldn't even conceive of it in the past.
Yeah, it's so I'm so grateful for your research, and there's so much more we need to understand about things. I did have a question to ask you. So the law, because I did my doctoral dissertation on wanting to create models that the legal system can use to evaluate undue influence. And the law says if you're 18, then you're an adult and you should be tried as an adult. And my understanding is it takes you to 25 or 26 years of age before you're more fully formed in terms of controlling impulsivity and executive control. What sayest thou?
I think it's a great question, and it's an area of some controversy, as you can imagine, in terms of the disconnect between the law and legal scholars and neuroscientists, right? And exactly as you said, from a neuroscience perspective, we now know that the brain doesn't fully mature, meaning finish consolidating. We could talk about what that means until the mid-20s, right? And of course, everyone, like everything in humans, there's some range around that. Some people mature a little early, some mature a little later. But what's interesting to me is that the car insurance actuarials actually were ahead of the neuroscientists, right?
Well, they're always
That's right.
smarter.
Well, and if you look at insurance rates for cars and age, it's around the mid-20s that they start to come down. Because magically, kids in their mid-20s all of a sudden are better drivers. No, they're not all of a sudden better drivers. They have a better brain that has better executive function and better impulse control and makes better decisions, which make them better drivers, right? And so...
Yeah, now you're prodding my memory to another one of your recommendations. Don't text and drive, or don't be on your phone.
Yeah, let's talk about that because I think of the awful consequences that I talk about in the book, many of which are around mental health, also physical health, right? Obesity, myopia, poor sleep, and all the consequences that have. Outside of increased rates of suicide, which is tragic, but still only affects a relatively small number of people, there's only one other deadly outcome to this device, and it's the automobile. And if you look at the history of death per mile, which is a nice metric because it controls for how many cars are on the road and economic influences and other things in this country. Death per mile in this country has been going down steadily for decades until
after we got seatbelt
laws, airbags, sensors of all types, better road signs, better lighting on roads. I mean, innovation after innovation after innovation around driver safety was actually having a positive impact on the death per mile until 2016. And the first time, now that we've got penetration of smartphones, right, well above 75%, death per mile ticks up. And it does it again in 2017, and again in 2018, and again in 2019. We are reversing a 40-year trend in death per mile because of a particular habit and another insidious brain trick. So let me walk you and your audience through this, because I think this is important, right? So let's talk about...
It will save lives. Listen,
well, let's
people.
talk about habit, right? So what is a habit, right? As a habit is a way in which your brain, and particularly an area of the brain called the striatum, takes multiple steps, right? And I like to use the example of learning to ride a bike, right? You got to, actually, let's talk about a car, right? It's better. We're talking about cars, right? You get in the car for the first time, you got to figure out where to put the keys, where the drive is, adjust the mirrors, all kinds of steps that you have to do. And you have to think about each one, which gas and brake and all this stuff. And the first time you do that, you literally have to think about each one of them. Over time, the striatum begins to pull a series of those actions together into a single action unit. It's almost like a computer code that can sort of roll the tape and you don't have to think about it. So habits are ways in which the brain has evolved to make complex tasks more efficient. Well, there's another habit we were talking about earlier, right? It was media multitask. So imagine I'm in my living room and I'm watching TV and I'm on my phone, and I occasionally get I talk about the text ping and app ring, the siren song of the smartphone, and I
notifications,
right? Right. It vibrates. It does all kinds of things to call for our attention, and I pick it up because I'm just sitting there watching TV. Now, what's the consequence of that action? Well, I might miss something on the TV. And I might miss a little bit of the plot, or God forbid I miss a commercial trying to sell me something I don't need. The consequence is actually pretty small, right?
Right.
What is the consequence when I'm in my car and I'm going 50, 60, 70 miles an hour, with the equivalent of what a friend of mine called, a guided missile, and I'm one sort of distracted moment away from killing someone or myself or a loved one. And the same thing happens. And what do? We pick it up. Now, here's the insidious part. Two things. One, unfortunately, modern cars are so sophisticated and we've gotten so good at driving that at 50, 60, 70, 80 miles an hour on a highway going straight, we actually get bored, right? It can be boring. And going back to the beginning part of the book, I talk about how we use media as a mood regulator. And one of the things we learned... Yeah,
this is an important mood regulator.
One of the things that I learned, and kids are very vulnerable to this, but we all are, is that when we were doing consumer neuroscience and watching when do people pick up their phone while they're watching TV, it was usually during the commercials, right? Because commercials aren't why you're there. And then we saw in other studies that people, they pick up their phone when they're bored, right? We're in an elevator, pick up the phone. Right, you're sitting alone in the doctor's office waiting. Pick up the phone. Everybody does it, right? So unfortunately, we can get bored while we're driving, and the temptation, right, to grab that phone is very high. So you have to be really, really, really careful. And then the other brain trick is that that we are used to multitasking and learn to multitasking often in a safe environment. Right? Again, at home, what's the worst thing that can happen? You miss a little bit of the show. At work, what's the worst thing that can happen? You miss what Joe said, or you miss a notification, or you're a little slower on your thing. Not the end of the world, although over time that will add up. In the car, it can be deadly. And so I really want people, and I think automobile manufacturers need to really step up their game a little bit and make it harder, not easier, to use these devices while we're driving.
Yeah, that's a really, really wonderful point. Oh, There's so many things I want to talk to you about, but not enough time in this particular interview. So maybe we can do a part 2 at some point in the future. So we've been talking a lot to parents, and you've been talking a lot to educators, I think, as well as to adults. If someone from the White House or people who have the means to really make policy changes, use this opportunity to opine about what your recommendations are.
I'm not a policy wonk, so I won't be able to tell you what chapter and verse what I would recommend. But I think what I would recommend is, first of all, we're going to need, the Health and Human Services and the CDC and the NIH to really increase their budget so we can do more research. Because that's really at the core of all this. There's a lot of great research happening, but I think given the risk, right, of a generation of humans being rewired to the extent that they can't make good judgments at a time when we need good judgment more than ever, I would say this is a high priority. And so I think first we need to do and fund better research. Second, I think there needs to be a very serious conversation about how we begin to put some rules and regulations in place, right? When I talk to parents about what kind of content I recommend for kids for that 1 hour a day, because kids should have some entertainment life, I say long-form, professionally produced content that has a clear beginning, middle, and end, and hopefully has some educational goals. Why?
Storytelling.
Well, storytelling, but also the FCC. Right, and there's rules about what you can produce, and I would be much more comfortable having my kid and your kid exposed to things that have, aren't going to have foul language, aren't going to have all kinds of references and violence and everything that happens. And the key part of the, some of the rules around social media is not being a media channel, even though it's in the name. Right, got them off the hook, right? And I think we need to revisit that. I think number 3, we need to figure out a way to make it a common expectation for everyone to start to have some kind of digital literacy in their lives, whether it's avoiding being recruited and radicalized online, or avoiding the trap of misinformation, or avoiding all the divisiveness and how, look, the reality is I'm involved in a nonprofit that did this amazing study. When you look at Democrats and Republicans' views of each other, they're just as divided as you think. But they're mostly divided around the way I think the other side thinks of me. When you ask them how they actually think about the other side, about particular issues, they're actually closer than we think. So some of this divisiveness is actually artificial, because of the echo chambers and stuff we live in. So I think we need to begin to think about and talk about what does digital literacy mean. That means we need the education schools, we need all schools to think about, sex ed, digital ed, every ed, and so that kids at the early age are given the tools so that they can succeed in a world where these devices are ascendant.
Yeah, absolutely. So can I ask you about folks on the spectrum? Because I have noticed a trend that some of the people who are most prone to being radicalized online are high-functioning folks on the spectrum, and they meet their recruiter on doing video gaming. And my understanding is that the part of the brain lights up that they believe it's a friend, even though they have no idea who's on the other side of the screen playing the game with them. Any comments or thoughts on that?
And this might be a nice place to wrap up, which is, one of the I think takeaways from the book for the academy, right, for the psychology and psychiatry and brain and mental health researchers and clinicians to take away from this book is that we need to be much smarter and more nuanced about thinking about the risk factors, right, for people who could get pulled into radicalization, pulled into misinformation, pulled into video game addiction, pulled into media multitasking. And what I've learned, shouldn't be surprising, is that people who are more risk are those who have had some kind of adverse life event, or pre-existing mental health condition, which, every mental health disorder, whether it's spectrum, autism, or depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, is a deficit of the prefrontal cortex, right, at some level. So anything we could do to stimulate brain health and realize that there are certain populations that are going to be at more risk than others. Look, everyone's at risk because we're all changing our habits and we're all fundamentally rewiring our brains around those habits. Full stop. That's just a fact. But there are going to be some people who are at more risk than others, and I think clinicians across the board have to recognize that and begin to screen and think about how to help people.
Yeah, and to understand that neurogenesis, neuroplasticity is something we can use as clinicians to help people overcome past trauma or deficits and such. There's just a lot of positive things that could be gained, as well as understanding that we really, we should be in control of our own minds and not let somebody else control, or not let the smartphone control us.
Well, can I just comment on that as a nice way to end, which is,
yes,
one of the core premises of this book is, to date, because we're in the early stage of the smartphone revolution, is we have been far too reactive than proactive to this technology. Right, and so part of what digital literacy does is says it's time to be proactive, right? We need to be in control of the conversation for ourselves, for our children, for society, not just constantly reacting to what's given to us.
Proactive, please. Rewired. Dr. Carl D. Marci, protecting your brain in the digital age. Thank you, Dr. Marci, for your good work, and I hope we can talk again. I have a million other questions to ask you. Yeah, are you still affiliated with Harvard? You're assistant professor
there, and I still see patients
of psychiatry. So I'm going to invite you to speak at our forensic think tank at Harvard Medical School, because I think this is groundbreaking material. Thank you again.
My pleasure.